tout d'abord, je vous remercie à toutes et à tous d'être venus. Je vais vous présenter notre conférencier célèbre. Tout d'abord, je vais dire quelques mots en anglais pour le remercier. Ensuite, je vous le présenterai en français. So, I just said thanks to everyone for coming here. We have Sir Jim Skea, who is invited for his doctorate honoris causa of Sorbonne Université. And we are very honored and delighted to have you and to give a talk. So just to give you a few points on the audience. So in the audience, we have about 40% of people who are students. 40% des personnes ici sont des étudiants et des étudiants. We are also very happy to have you here because you are a university professor, so we are very happy to have you here at our university. So I'm going to introduce your CV quickly in French because you know your CV, obviously. Pour rapidement vous donner des informations, le professeur est un spécialiste des énergies renouvelables et des politiques environnementales. Ce qui est intéressant, c'est qu'il est diplômé d'un master de physique mathématique de l'Université d'Édimbourg et ensuite il a fait sa thèse en recherche énergétique à Cambridge. Il est passé par plusieurs universités et actuellement il est professeur émérite d'énergie durable à l'Imperial College de Londres. Il a participé à de nombreuses commissions, ce serait difficile de toutes les lister, mais pour vous donner quelques exemples, il a participé à la commission britannique sur le changement climatique et la commission écossaise sur la transition juste. Vous le connaissez pour sa participation au GIEC, avant d'en assurer la présidence depuis juillet 2023. Il a coprésidé le groupe de travail 3, portant sur les mesures d'atténuation du changement climatique. Et il a contribué à plusieurs rapports spéciaux du GIEC en 2016, 2019 et 2022. Dans la poste de présidence qu'il occupe actuellement, il a donné 3 grands axes pour son travail et pour les travaux de ce comité, l'inclusivité et la diversité, l'interdisciplinarité et la pertinence politique des rapports d'évaluation. Voilà. Il a été énormément soutenu par ses pairs et par les institutions. Et dernière chose en date, il a été fait par le roi d'Angleterre, chevalier du Royaume-Uni, en 2024. Voilà. Donc il s'agit d'un séminaire exceptionnel qui est organisé donc, par l'UFR Terre, Environnement, Biodiversité de la Faculté des Sciences et Ingénierie de Sorbonne Université, en partenariat avec l'Institut Pierre-Simon Laplace. Et d'ailleurs, demain, à la cérémonie des docteurs honoris causa, Jim Skea sera introduit par Robert Vautard, ex-directeur de l'IPSL. Donc, vous avez le titre de sa présentation ici. Donc, on va partir pour 45 minutes de présentation et ensuite, nous aurons une session de questions. Voilà. So, Jim, thank you very much for being here and we are thank you.
Merci bien et je m'excuse. Je parle en anglais, c'est mieux pour vous et c'est mieux pour moi. In the next 45 minutes, I'm going to do 3 things. First of all, I want to talk a little bit about how IPCC, GIEC, works and its relationship with the policy process. I want to summarise as briefly as I can the key conclusions from the 6th assessment cycle, which ended about 18 months ago. And thirdly, I want to indicate what IPCC's plans are for the coming cycle, which will run through till about 2030 and will end in about 5 years' time. So just to start off, what is IPCC for? I won't read my way all through this, but it is to assess scientific and technical and socioeconomic information relevant to understanding human-induced climate change, impacts, and also options for adaptation and mitigation. And that brings to the second point that our report should be neutral with respect to policy, but they do need to deal objectively with information that is relevant to the application of specific policies. So to be short about it, we are supposed to be policy relevant, but not policy prescriptive. And to make it very clear, IPCC does not conduct its own research. It assesses published scientific literature to bring together, assess, synthesize conclusions from the literature that's taken place, that has been published over a period of time. Now, the structure of IPCC, and it is very important to emphasize that the I in IPCC stands for intergovernmental. It is not international, it is intergovernmental, which means that ultimately it's the governments that own the process. And the members of IPCC are not the individual scientists, they're the 195 countries that make up the member states of IPCC. And they meet typically twice a year in plenary sessions to take key decisions. Once every cycle, which lasts between 5 and 7 years, more typically 7, the plenary, the governments elect a scientific leadership called the Bureau, which includes myself, the chair, but also includes the co-chairs of different working groups within IPCC. So the working groups cover Working Group 1, the physical science bases, which is actually co-chaired by Robert Vautard from the Université Paris-Saclay and his colleague Xiaoyi Zhang from China. That covers the physical science basis. We have a second working group which covers climate impacts, adaptation and vulnerability, and that is being co-chaired by people from the Netherlands and Singapore at the moment. And we have a third working group on the mitigation of climate change, and that is co-chaired by people from the United States and Malaysia at the moment. I should say that is my homeland, Working Group 3, because I was co-chair of Working Group 3 in the previous cycle, along with a good colleague from India. And one other thing, there's something, a part of IPCC that sometimes flies under the radar, which is the Task Force on National Greenhouse Gas Inventories. And that is the part of IPCC that provides guidance on the methods that countries use to report their emissions and removals of greenhouse gases to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. And in the past, it has been a very technical body. It has actually become a little more political over the last few years because of the particular topics it has been asked to address, as I will come on to. So the Bureau of IPCC consists of 34 elected members, and they are elected for the entire cycle. Now, just to say on the process by which reports are produced, it is a long and sometimes painful process, the way that we go about producing reports. And it can be more than 3 years between the initial conception of report and when the report is finally approved. And the first stage is to scope out a particular report once the governments have decided they want to produce it. So there is a scientific meeting that produces a draft outline of the report. But that is not the final outline, because that then goes to the entire panel session. Up to 195 countries then go over these outlines word for word, chapter by chapter, before they approve what the outline is. And we've just been through that process in the last month or so, and extremely painful, I might say it was too. It's only once we have agreed the outline of the report that we can call for the nomination of authors to actually write the report, because we don't know what skills are needed until the outline has been produced. And it's up to governments and observer organisations to nominate experts as authors of the report. And it is the Bureau, the elected leadership of IPCC, that selects the authors, taking out account of a number of important criteria. including, importantly, scientific competence, obviously, but also gender, a balance of people between developed and developing countries, and a balance of people from different regions of the world. And additionally, a balance of people who are new to IPCC and those who have more experience. So a difficult set of criteria to be applied. Once the teams start to write the report, there are two sections of reviewing. A first draft, a first order draft, it's called for some reason I still don't understand. The first order draft is reviewed by experts, and that's open to anyone to review it. And it is worth noting this is a meticulous process. Every single comment is recorded, and the authors must respond to every single comment. And there can be thousands of comments on individual chapters. And once the report is published, all of these comments and all of the responses are published for complete transparency. So it's quite a painful process. Once it goes through expert review, it then goes through a government and expert review where the governments put in their comments. It's the same kind of process. Every comment is registered and every response is registered. And it's only at that point that the final draft is produced. And the so-called summary for policymakers, the SPM, is sent to governments for further review. And this summary for policymakers is absolutely critical. It's the shortish document, maybe target 25 or 30 pages, which summarises the entire report. And once the authors have received comments on the summary for policymakers, they revise it, and it goes to a final approval session where governments and scientists go through the summary, paragraph by paragraph, line by line, word for word, until there is complete consensus in the room with all the governments and the scientists about what the report contains. And some of these approval sessions can be quite long and quite difficult in nature. And if you hear stories about IPCC operating all night, these are the kind of sessions that we're talking about. They really are quite challenging. So I think I've covered basically how IPCC works. And just to say, I'm on my third consecutive cycle of IPCC, and I am still discovering new things. So I think nobody truly understands completely how IPCC works. Now, I want to flag a couple of the challenges that we're facing at the moment, including the interactions with policy. And this is a summary from the Web of Knowledge database about the number of publications released annually every year since IPCC started across the successive cycles, and we're on the 7th at the moment. And you can see the brutal exponential growth in publication that we, as people who have to assess and synthesize the literature, are facing. The growth rate is about 10% per year, which means that basically the volume of literature is doubling every cycle. So every cycle, there is as much new literature as had ever been published previously on the topic of climate change. So 6,000 papers a month at the moment, and a real challenge. And we are actually going to be running a workshop fairly shortly to think about whether we can use techniques like large language models and other techniques to help us cut through that huge volume of literature. It's also a challenge because people are encouraging us to take more account of other forms of knowledge that may not be embodied in the scientific literature, like, for example, government evaluations of policy success, or indigenous knowledge, which is often not codified. So we have a double challenge there, people wanting to expand the set of knowledge systems that IPCC assesses, but again, still this relentless growth in the volume of the basic scientific literature. So we have a lot of challenges there. This slide is trying to sum up, again from the start of IPCC, which was in 1988, the interactions between IPCC and the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. And the first IPCC was actually established before the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change was ever signed, which was 1992. So the first assessment report of IPCC was actually quite influential in the way that the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change was set up. The second assessment report in 1995 played a big role in guiding the way that the Kyoto Protocol developed. And I might say, if any of you ever visit London, there's a wonderful play on at the moment called Kyoto, which manages to incorporate the entire negotiating session into a single play from the point of view of the oil industry lobbyist who played quite an active role there. So if you're ever in London in the near future for that, I thoroughly recommend it. My team went as a group, and it felt like a real, like we were back at work again as we watched this play. So the fifth assessment report informed the Paris Agreement, which was obviously quite foundational in terms of where the international negotiations are at the moment. And subsequent reports, for example, the sixth assessment report, had a big implications for COP28 in Dubai, which, for the first time introduced the phrases like transitioning away from fossil fuels. So IPCC has been there, and we interact very regularly. We go to all the conferences of the parties. We go to the intersessional meetings in Bonn, and we have many direct connections with the individual presidencies of the conferences of the parties as well. Now, because of that, we actually received specific invitations from the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, and I'd just like to highlight two, because they will be picked up later. First one is inviting IPCC to consider how to align its work with the global stocktakes that take place every 5 years under the Paris Agreement. And the next global stocktake is due to conclude in 2028, which is roughly within the time frame of the current IPCC cycle. There was also a decision recently to invite IPCC to update guidelines which were last produced in 1994, more than 30 years ago, for assessing climate change impacts and adaptation. And again, they wanted us to do that as part of the seventh cycle. And again, I will come up to that. I might say I'm probably the only person around IPCC whose name is listed as one of the authors of these 1994 guidelines. So people look at me for institutional knowledge, and I have to confess I cannot remember a thing about it. I am completely useless in terms of institutional memory there. So turning to the conclusions of the sixth assessment report of IPCC, it ran to 10,000 pages in all, and I am often asked to sum that up in 10 to 15 minutes, which is a major challenge. And one of the ways I've taken to telling the story is to look at the three goals of the Paris Agreement and pick up key conclusions that are relevant for each of these three goals. So the first goal is the so-called long-term temperature goal, limiting warming to well below 2 degrees and pursuing efforts to limit the increase to 1.5. Second, increasing the ability to adapt to the adverse impacts of climate change and foster climate resilience. And the third one, more about means of implementation, ensuring that finance flows from developed to developing countries are adequate for pursuing a global path for low greenhouse gas emissions and climate resilient development. And it's worthwhile saying that all of these three goals are specifically mentioned to be in the context of sustainable development and efforts to eradicate poverty. So let me actually start with the second goal first on enhancing adaptation and resilience to climate change. And I'm about to summarize the entire thing in about 2 slides, which is a challenge, so you will realize I will be missing a lot out. One of the communication mechanisms that has been developed in IPCC to look at the risks of climate change are these so-called burning ember diagrams. In other words, the intensity of the colours represent the level of risk that we face in relation to different levels of global warming. And if you peer closely, you will see warming levels above pre-industrial on the left-hand side. So it's going up to 5 degrees warming altogether. And just to say, this is not just an artist's impression. There is science behind the choice of the colours. And the purple colours, the most intense risks, refer to high risks, which are severe, can affect large populations or large chunks of ecosystems, and may well be irreversible. So that's what is meant by a high risk, and there's a gradation on the way. So on the left-hand side, we have land-based systems, and you can see in particular, between 1.5 and 2 degrees warming, we are making the transition for moderate risks, which are detectable but not severe, through to higher levels of risks. And this applies to wildfire damage, permafrost degradation, and biodiversity loss, all becoming more intense between 1.5 and 2 degrees. It might be said on land-based systems there are also, as you go beyond 2 degrees, threats to agricultural systems with consequences for food security, prices, and availability. On the right-hand side, we have the ocean and coastal ecosystems risks. And just to flag that they don't look quite so severe, but between 2 and 3 degrees, they're certainly moving into high risks. The one that is important are the warm water corals on the left-hand side, where at 2 degrees, we would see them disappearing almost entirely, and at 1.5 degrees warming, about 3/4 of warm water corals disappearing. And we are already in that zone. Last year, the world was warmer by about 1.53 degrees beyond the pre-industrial level. That is a single year. It's not the longer-term average, which we tend to take over 10 or 20 years. And even last year, the best estimate of the long-term average was 1.3 degrees. So we are already starting to see these effects on our television screens or through personal experience. Wildfires, extreme weather, flooding, all of these things we are starting to see. And it is perhaps surprised scientists the extent to which we see these kinds of changes happening. The good news is that adaptation measures can actually reduce the risks for particular risks. So on the left-hand side, we see the risks of heat-related morbidity and mortality. And the degree of risk is affected by the amount of adaptation that might be there in terms of infrastructure development, labour practices, for example, all of which might be important in terms to helping adapt to the kind of risks that are faced. Food insecurity can also be affected by the kind of socioeconomic development pathways that we follow. The SSP on the right-hand side refers to shared socioeconomic pathways, and SSP3 is sort of middle of the road, and SSP1 refers more to a sustainable development-oriented pattern of development overall. So the background socioeconomic conditions can have an effect on the kind of risks that we face. So I think these are important points to raise because often we are criticised for frightening people into action. We need to emphasize that there are things that we can do about this. Human beings do have agency about our own future. Now, I want to do a few slides that are sort of lead into the long-term temperature goal, which is about current status and trends. And what we have on the left-hand side is a projection of emissions through to about 2050. And the pink band at the top refers to the projected trend from policies that are currently implemented around the world. And what would happen there is that we would continue to see slight increases in global emissions of greenhouse gases. If we were to limit warming to 1.5 degrees, we would need to put ourselves on the blue band at the bottom, which involves cutting emissions by more than 40% by 2030 compared to 2020. And it is manifestly true that we have not done so from 2020. Emissions have continued at roughly the current level. And even to get limiting warming to 2 degrees, which is the green band, we would need to cut emissions by about 25% over the decade. So we are not on track at the moment, and that is a very strong conclusion from the last report. The purple band with the inflection in it at 2030 refers to what would happen if countries fulfilled their current commitments through to 2030, but then tried to put themselves on a path to limiting warming to 2 degrees. And it is still possible to do that, but 1.5 degrees would be beyond reach, and we would certainly need to accelerate the action in terms of emissions reduction. So it's not an optimistic story in terms of where we are globally in terms of emissions. And this is not, in fact, from an IPCC report. It's from the United Nations Environment Programme Emissions Gap Report, which came out at the back end of last year. And it shows you how warm the world is likely to be under different scenarios. So if we carry on with current policies, around 3 degrees warming by the end of the century, and you can compare that with the burning embers risk diagrams I showed earlier. If nationally determined contributions, all the unconditional elements were fulfilled, it's still up 2.5 to 3 degrees. And if elements of the nationally determined contributions from countries that were conditional on, for example, finance flows, we would get it down to around the 2.5 level. And it's only if all of the conditional nationally determined contributions and all the net zero pledges, net zero emissions pledges made by government out to the second half of the 21st century were fulfilled, that we get towards about 2 degrees warming. But no, none of these scenarios is down at the 1.5 level. Even with the most ambitious picture, we're somewhere in the 1.5 to 2 degree range. Now, one other thing that I want to mention has been a huge part of the debate between governments is the question of the distribution of emissions around different regions of the world. And here it's not just current present-day emissions, but historical emissions going back to the pre-industrial era that people want to refer to. So, for example, on the left-hand side, we have historical cumulative emissions of carbon dioxide by different regions of the world. And what we need to flag up is that for 2 regions of the world, North America and Europe, they account for around 40% of these historical emissions. And this compares, for example, with Southern Asia, which includes India, down at about 40%, and other Africa down at about 7%, with most of that actually coming from land use change rather than from fossil fuel use. So there are such huge differences in terms of historic emissions. This plays into the negotiations. And on the right-hand side, we have a snapshot of present-day greenhouse gas emissions by different regions, again showing that big difference. So North America, again leading the pack with almost 20 tons of carbon dioxide equivalent per capita. Europe, roughly equivalent down to Western Europe, lower than China now, in fact, and Eastern Asia. But again, Africa and Southern Asia, right down at the bottom, 2 to 3 tons per carbon dioxide per capita. So these debates, which we really exposed in the 6th assessment report, are really playing into the international negotiations. Now, again, as with adaptation, the good news side of it, I mean, one of the big successes over the last decade or so has been the progress that we've made with renewable electricity. And it's been driven by huge falls in costs over the last decade or so. So photovoltaic, solar PV on the left-hand side, and also battery costs on the right-hand side, we have seen about 80% declines in the cost. And what that means, because that orange bar that's going across is the equivalent cost of generating electricity from fossil fuels, is that wind and solar energy in many parts of the world are now cost competitive with traditional energy. And that is a very good news, and it's moving us in the right direction. And at the bottom of the slide, you can see the huge progress that's been taking place in market adoption. And at the moment, we have solar and wind energy now accounting for about 12% of electricity generation globally, which is a huge, huge advance to have made in quite a short period of time. One of the issues there is that the adoption of renewable energy has taken place in 3 parts of the world, in North America, in Europe and China, and the big challenge is to take that out to other parts of the world which experience financial challenges and also challenges with access to grid infrastructure. So turning to the long-term temperature goals specifically, the well below 2 degrees pursuing efforts towards 1.5. This again is getting to the net zero picture. So on the left-hand side, scenarios that are compatible with limiting warming to 1.5 degrees. And we have separate lines here for total greenhouse gases, carbon dioxide and methane. And basically the story is for carbon dioxide, we would need to get to net zero emissions by about 2050 to limit warming to 1.5 degrees. Greenhouse gas net zero would be much later in the century, perhaps into the 2090s roughly. And methane, CH4, goes down, but obviously never reaches zero. And on the right-hand side, we have the 2-degree numbers, which obviously imply slightly later net zero dates. So we are seeing net zero carbon dioxide moving out to around 2070. And in fact, greenhouse gas emissions do not reach net zero within the 21st century in these 2-degree scenarios. But it's sending a very clear picture. If the Paris long-term temperature goal is to be achieved, we do need to get to net zero emissions in the middle or in the latter part of the next century. But again, very optimistic pictures about what can be done in the short term. And this was a figure which may be a bit difficult to read on the screen, but caught a lot of attention from journalists, which is the potential emission reductions for specific technologies and specific approaches that could be exercised in the near term up to about 2030. So the energy, there's a set of energy measures at the top, and the biggest potential comes from wind energy and solar energy, but also at the bottom, reducing methane emissions from oil and gas systems. And there are other issues with more limited potential, for example, nuclear energy, carbon capture and storage, which have more limited potential in the short term, though they might have a bigger potential in the medium term. And at the bottom end of the slide, AFLU, which stands for Agriculture, Forestry and Other Land Use. So these land-based measures also have a big potential opportunity, changing agricultural practices to sequester carbon in soils, reduce conversion of forests and other ecosystems, and as well as that, ecosystem restoration, afforestation and reforestation. Now, I just want you to note that there's colour coding on this slide as well. And the blue part of it is actually measures which make sense by themselves. They have a negative cost. If there was no climate change, if there was no carbon pricing, it would still make sense to introduce these measures. And most of the measures on this slide, in fact, are available at less than $100 per tonne of carbon dioxide equivalent, which is roughly the range in which the EU emission trading scheme is sitting at the moment. Now, one other potentially optimistic picture that we picked up from the last cycle was that for the first time in an IPCC report, we started to looking not only at technical opportunities for emission reduction, but also the potential from changes in consumption patterns and behaviour that could result in reduced emissions. And the way the authors approached that was they started to think about what are the basic services that human beings need: nutrition, mobility, shelter, and to think how these needs for services could be delivered in ways that had reduced greenhouse gas emissions. And the conclusion from that, depending on the sector, that by 2050, emissions could be reduced by between 40 and 70% in different sectors by meeting these basic human needs in a more efficient and effective way. And one point that came strongly about this is that in making these behavioural changes, It's not only about individual choices, though individual choices matter. The context also matters. It depends on the availability of infrastructure and the provision of technology that enable people to make these choices. So very simply, obvious example with electric vehicles, consumers will not choose electric vehicles unless there is a charging infrastructure and unless manufacturers provide the technology and the vehicles that actually help to satisfy needs. But once again, a very optimistic picture about what could be done if the efforts were to be put in. And I think this is almost the final one here. Another new element that came into the 6th assessment cycle, which will be picked up again in much more detail in the 7th, is the question of carbon dioxide removal from the atmosphere. To reach net zero emissions, you need to take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, because there are sectors where intrinsically emissions will continue to go into the atmosphere, and they would need to be compensated by removals if we are to get to net zero. And what the report did for the first time was to produce a kind of typology of different carbon dioxide removal techniques that were categorized according to the removal process. Was it biological? Was it ocean-based? Was it geochemical? Or was it chemical? And a land-based biological approach would be afforestation, and a chemical approach would be something like direct air capture of carbon dioxide. So a range of different measures. And the storage medium, once you've removed the carbon dioxide, could also be very different. You could incorporate carbon dioxide in wood products and make buildings that are more reliant on wood. That is sequestering carbon from the atmosphere. We can change agricultural practices so that carbon builds up in soils. And obviously, afforestation is one of the key existing techniques there. But for other kinds of carbon capture, it may mean putting the carbon dioxide into geological formations. So it's very clear that carbon dioxide removal is not a single technology. It's a range of different approaches. And so far, the approach that has been most used relate to forests. And just one last slide in this section, just to emphasize that we do have the tools to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And if we look back over the last 10 to 15 years, we can already identify gigatons of greenhouse gas emissions that have been avoided through policies that have already been put in place. Climate legislation covers more than half of global emissions, and about a fifth of emissions are covered by some kind of carbon pricing. And we have a big tool set that doesn't only include pricing, it includes regulation, standards, sunset requirements on different technologies, information and advice, and with my Scottish Just Transition experience, skills, training and supply chain developments that can take us in the right direction. And with technology cooperation and finance will play a very important role internationally. And I want to go into the just one slide on the final goal of the Paris Agreement, which is the consistent financial flows. And this is a figure which basically compares current investment flows for different kinds of technology, by region, by type of economy, and compares with what would be needed to be compatible with the Paris Agreement long-term temperature goal by 2030. And to put it very shortly, the gap is huge. Investments would need to increase by a factor of between 3 and 6 to put us on a pathway to limiting warming to less than 2 degrees at least. The gaps are actually least for energy supply and electricity. The gap is about a factor of 2 to 5. The gaps are bigger for energy efficiency, for transport, and especially for agriculture, forestry, and land use, which often involves changing the practices of perhaps hundreds of millions, even billions of farmers or landowners. The gaps are bigger for developing countries than they are for developed countries, and they vary also considerably by different regions of the world. So that's a big question. It's a big statement. We do need to increase financial flows very considerably if we are to reach the kind of targets that have been set under the Paris Agreement. Now, I'm going to turn on to the final section, is what are the plans for IPCC within the 7th assessment cycle, which started about 18 months ago, and as I say, will end in 2030. So, we already have work underway at the moment. We agreed the outline of a special report on climate change in cities with governments. We've selected all the authors, and the first lead authors meeting actually took place in Osaka in Japan earlier this month. And this report is due to be completed by early 2027. And I might say I wasn't at the meeting myself, but I've heard very good reports about how constructive a meeting that was and how well it moved forward. The task force on inventories that I mentioned at the beginning is working on a so-called methodology report on short-lived climate forces, which is a long way of saying it's things like nitrous oxide, sulfur dioxide, volatile organic compounds, almost traditional pollutants that do have implications for climate change. And again, the outline has been approved, authors have been selected, and the first lead authors meeting is actually taking place right at this moment in Bilbao in Spain. And this report is due to be approved in late 2027. And just to be very specific about what a methodology report does, it's not an assessment of all the literature. It produces guidance on how to estimate emissions of these short-lived climate forces. So it has a much more limited and technical scope. Once again, in this cycle, there will be the 3 traditional working group reports. Working Group 1, Physical Science, Working Group 2, Impacts, Adaptation and Vulnerability, and Working Group 3 on mitigation, i.e. reducing emissions or increasing removals of greenhouse gases from the atmosphere. And the governments had actually agreed about a year ago that these reports would be produced in that order. We had a scoping meeting for the 3 working group reports in Malaysia just at the end of last year in Kuala Lumpur, and the panel actually agreed the outlines of these reports at a plenary in China at the end of last month. I might say this was probably one of the most brutal sessions I've ever seen in going. Our final session started at 8 o'clock on Friday morning, and we finally walked out of the room at 10:35 on Saturday evening without any break whatsoever. This was a full 38-hour session without a halt to get these outlines agreed. And there were a lot of controversial issues in there, which I'll come on to in a second. The thing that is remaining here that has yet to be decided, we have yet to decide by what schedule, what is the timing of each of these reports. And this comes back to the invitation that the UNFCCC made to IPCC earlier about aligning its work with the global stocktakes under the Paris Agreement. And there is debate as to whether it is necessary to complete all of the reports in time for the second global stocktake in 2028. And as we are at the moment, the governments are completely stalled on it. Some countries want alignment with the second global stocktake. Other countries would like to go more slowly, paying attention to issues like the time that's available for governments to review reports, time for literature coming from emerging countries to be available for assessment. So we're stuck there, and we need to come back to it at the 63rd session of IPCC later this year. In addition, along with this, the Working Group 2 report, alongside the Working Group 2 report, we have accepted the invitation from the UNFCCC to produce new technical guidelines on assessing impacts and adaptation, with a special emphasis on indicators, metrics, and methodologies. We also scoped this in Kuala Lumpur and got it agreed in Hangzhou, I have to say without very much difficulty in that case. And as in every cycle of IPCC, there will be a synthesis report that links together the findings from the 3 working group reports to try to pull it all together and look at some of the topics that can only be addressed by taking findings from each individual working group. And that falls to me as chair to produce that one, but that job comes a little later in the cycle. Now, one piece of work that I should say is outstanding that went to a scoping meeting was a methodology report on carbon dioxide removal technologies and carbon capture, utilisation and storage. There was a scientific scoping meeting held for that. It produced a recommendation for the governments, but the governments failed to reach agreement on the outline of that report when we met in Hangzhou in China last month. In my view, we were very close to agreement, and I think we could probably get that done at the 63rd session. And just to say, the controversy was essentially about carbon dioxide removal for water, from water bodies, for example, using alkalinization to reduce the acidity of the water, effectively remove carbon dioxide. It proved extremely controversial. Now, I've got just 3 or 4 last slides because we have just agreed the outlines of the working group report. So let me show them quickly without going through all of the detail. So working group 1 on the physical science, a nice working group 1 which is being co-led by Robert Votard from Paris-Saclay, has a wonderfully simple approach. Look at the small number of words in each of these chapter titles. It is so clean and easy and scientific and sort of black and white in nature, except for 2 chapters. Chapter 8, which includes the phrase tipping points, which were extremely controversial among governments when we came to agreeing the outline. And that resulted in the very long chapter title that refers to abrupt changes, low likelihood, high impact events, critical thresholds, etc. Governments wanted the whole thing listed that might be included in a definition of a tipping point. And chapter 9 also had quite a long title because it included the delicate phrase overshoot pathways, which means pathways which get to net zero and then start to remove from carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and then effectively bring global temperatures down. So the overshoot refers to going above a threshold like 1.5 degrees and coming back again by carbon dioxide removal. And that, again, is a very sensitive topic. I might say this chapter also includes a reference to solar radiation modification, which is a particularly controversial topic within IPCC and doesn't fit readily within the scope of any single working group. Working Group 2, Impacts, Adaptation and Vulnerability, always the report with the largest number of chapters, which are clustered in 3 different ways. There are global chapters, which are looking generally at vulnerabilities and impacts, assessing past progress with adaptation, assessing adaptation options for the future, and importantly, given debates within the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, responses to losses and damages, which refers to losses and damages beyond the ability to adapt to climate change, and it plays into international debates about a new loss and damage fund under the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. And there is a dedicated chapter on finance, which is the first time ever that Working Group 2 on impacts has considered financial issues. We have a set of regional chapters. There was a debate as whether polar regions should be in these region chapters, but in fact it's been absorbed into chapter 13 here, which are a set of thematic chapters looking at different types of ecosystem, terrestrial or ocean-based, freshwater, agriculture, forestry, food, fibre and fisheries, human settlements, and 2 quite new chapters on health and well-being and poverty, livelihoods, mobility and fragility. So it's really quite a comprehensive, and it starts to make a lot of sense when you see it laid out like this. The technical guidelines on assessing climate change impacts, which are closely related to Working Group 2, a much simpler structure. The heart of it are the technical guidelines in section 3. which is basically a kind of a manual for how to go about assessing impacts and adaptation. So scoping and goal setting, risk assessment, planning, implementation, learning, monitoring, and evaluation. I might say that the word evaluation was particularly difficult for many countries at the approval of the outlines, because countries feel that evaluation implies being critical and making a judgment of their policies. So we needed to choose the words very carefully when it came to evaluation, looking backwards and learning lessons. And finally, we've got the Working Group 3 contribution, quite a large number of chapters there. And I will just flag a couple of elements there. I mean, Chapter 1 introduces it. Chapter 2 is looking back at what has happened over the last decade or so. And then Chapter 3 is about scenarios and futures. And there was a lot of debate about Chapter 3 on the futures. And you can see how it's constructed. Projected futures in the context of sustainable development and climate change, making sustainable development and climate change co-equal in the title. We have a set of cross-cutting chapters, chapters 5 to 7, again a finance chapter, which Working Group 3 has had before, and then a set of sectoral chapters running through to agriculture, forestry, and other land use. And that also includes a Chapter 8 on services and demand, which is essentially about consumption patterns and behaviour, picking up on the novelty that took place in the 6th assessment cycle. And then finally, at the end of it, because it's very difficult to separate these different sectors and systems, a chapter on interactions and integration across sectors, and a final one on carbon dioxide removal, which is going to get a lot more attention in the coming cycle. So that's where we're going to go. Governments have agreed that these are the structures of the reports that will be produced, 2028 or 2029, depending on the schedule that is agreed. And just to stand back a bit and do a little bit of a reflection, from the outside, IPCC looks like an incredibly ordered kind of body. At the top left, we've got delegates going optimistically into a new plenary session of IPCC. I think that's actually at the campus in Nairobi. We start the session on the top right-hand corner in a very ordered kind of environment where people are making systematic interventions. By the time we get to these all-night sessions at the end, it's huddles, it's contact groups, it's people milling around the corridors, a much less formal process. And it takes a long, long time before we get to the point where we get to the final gavel of the meeting. So it is a very challenging process. Everyone I know who get involved in IPCC can't resist keeping in part of the process. I describe being in IPCC as like having malaria. It never leaves your system. People want to come back and come back again. So if you want to get involved IPCC, I might say that there is now a call for nominations for authors for all of the reports that I've described here, working groups 1, 2 and 3. And I presume the French government has set up a portal so that people can invite themselves to be nominated for IPCC. So with that, I will stop the formal presentation. I'm very happy to answer any questions and debate with people as appropriate. Thank you.